set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. So Steve and I are on a quest to pick out our favorite movies from the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And so we're going to dive in today with our top picks for the 30s. But Steve, I got to tell you, I wish we were in the same room.
Oh, I know. Me too. This is awful.
Yeah, we usually are in our studio together, everybody. And if it sounds a little different, it's because we were not able to get together. So we're doing this remotely. So if it seems a little strange, that's why. But the other thing I was going to say, and I don't know if, Steve, this came up for you, in looking at the decade of the 30s, was it difficult for you to pick just 4?
Oh, it was so difficult. I could have done 50.
Yeah. I could have too. And the other thing I noticed, we could do a whole episode on, fill in the blank. Yeah.
And there's certain movies from the 30s that are so iconic and that have been covered so much that we're not going to touch today. And people are going to be scratching their heads like, why didn't you talk about Gone with the Wind or The Wizard of Oz or Stagecoach or The Bride of Frankenstein? You know what? There's nothing that we can add to that conversation.
Right. I mean, you could do a whole episode on those, and maybe we will in the future. Yeah. But for now, we each have 4 films that we're going to talk about. I just wanted to say one thing about my list. It would have included Stella Dallas from 1937 had we not already talked about it in our Mother's Day episode. So if you haven't listened to that podcast, check that one out. I'm going to start with The Women from 1939.
Oh, great one.
Yeah, this film, it's directed by George Cukor, written by Anita Luce and Jane Murfin, from the play by Claire Booth Luce. Now, it was remade in 2008 by writer-director Diane English with a very storied cast. Meg Ryan in the lead as Mary Haines, our favorite Annette Bening as Sylvia Fowler, and Eva Mendes as Crystal Allen.
Can I interject for just a second?
Yeah, please.
I think the remake of The Women is the perfect example of why certain classic films should never be remade.
Yes. Thank you for adding that. I was trying to be a little more polite.
I know. You're so much nicer than I am.
You have to see the original. This film centers on the lives of a group of wealthy Manhattanites. They're led by the amazing Norma Shearer as Mary Haines, who learns from her friend. And because this is a podcast, I'm going to tell you, I'm using air quotes on friend. Her friend Sylvia Fowler, who's played by Rosalind Russell, she tells Mary that her husband Stephen is having an affair with the perfume counter girl Crystal Allen, played by Joan Crawford. At her wicked best, is there any actress better at playing wicked than her?
Oh, she's perfect in this role.
She's really perfect. And then it's one of the most stellar casts ever. I mean, Mary Boland, Paulette Goddard, Joan Fontaine, Marjorie Main, Virginia Gray, Ruth Hussey, and our sweet Virginia Weidler, who we talked about, who plays Little Mary Haines, Norma Shearer's daughter. Even famed gossip columnist Hedda Hopper makes an appearance in this film. So some things are problematic in this film, looking at it from today's sensibilities. I mean, one of the characters says she's going to get overhauled for her husband. Mary's mother tells her not to say anything about Stephen's affair. And, there are things like that. There's also the opening credits, which are a little problematic in that they assign an animal to each of the actresses. So Norma Shearer is a deer, and Joan Crawford is a leopard, and Rosalind Russell is a snarling cat. But there are more things to love about this film. It's famous for not having any male actors.
Yes. Isn't that great?
There were even rumors that all the dogs were female, all the animals in general, although there's been some disputes over the year that the horse was definitely a male and some of the dogs were male. Our friend Terry Toto also makes an appearance in this film at the very top of it, which we talked about in our episode about animals. One of the other reasons to love this film is Rosalind Russell is at her fast, quippy best. As I said, Joan Crawford, her phone call at the perfume counter when Stephen, the person she's having the affair with, is trying to break their date and she pretends it's her birthday. It's just absolute perfection. One of my favorite things, this is a black and white film, but about midway through the film, there is a fashion show that is in full Technicolor. And these outfits are, I would wear most of them today. They're in style right now. It's worth the price of admission just for the fashion. And then, of course, it's this smart and snappy dialogue. And then, of course, there's the trip to Reno to get the divorce. And finally, there's Norma Shearer, who some accuse of acting in a style that is very much of the silent era. But I so appreciated her in this role. She's able to fill her eyes with tears at the drop of a hat. The scene with Virginia Wilder in bed, scratching her back and having that little together moment, it's just heartbreaking. And then, of course, Mary Boland sang over and over, "L'Amour, L'Amour."
She was my favorite.
Yes, she's just fantastic. I can't say enough about it. It's actually free right now on Tubi, and you can also find it on other streaming services for $3.99, but it's worth $3.99 and much more if you don't have Tubi. The Women.
Great choice. What a way to start. My first film that I wanted to talk about, one of my favorites of the 1930s, it is from 1936, and it's The Petrified Forest. A little 411 on the movie. It was directed by Archie Mayo. It was written by Charles Kenyon and Delmer Daves. It's got a killer cast. It was released February 6, 1936. The film is the adaptation of the 1935 play by Robert E. Sherwood, and it takes place in this desolate, petrified forest region of Arizona. The way the story begins is Alan, played by the great Leslie Howard. He's this destitute but very romantic, poetic writer who's also a drifter, and he's just has wanderlust, and he can't really seem to settle down. And he wanders into this very lonely gas station and desert cafe in the middle of nowhere, where he meets this really beautiful waitress named Gabrielle, played by the incomparable Bette Davis at her finest.
Yes.
And she's just also this romantic idealist who just dreams of escaping her life in the petrified forest and studying art and seeing the world. So naturally they bond because they both are these kindred spirits of romantic, poetic types.
Right.
But everything changes, however, when this notorious gangster, Duke Mantee, played by Humphrey Bogart. Of course. This was really the role that made Humphrey Bogart star. And when you see the movie, you'll see why. He's phenomenal. And you really get that tough guy, Humphrey Bogart image that he so carefully cultivated and carried out through his career. But he shows up, he takes all the customers at the diner hostage. And then that's when you really start to see the clashing of these two worlds. You've got the romantic dreamers in Leslie Howard and Betty, and you've got the ruthless, brutal lawlessness of Duke Mantee and his men. It's an interesting social study of these two worlds and how they affect each other and how they feel about each other. This movie was the movie that introduced me to Humphrey Bogart, and it's probably my first experience watching a film where there was an anti-hero, which I didn't really understand what that meant. But then as I watched this movie as a kid, I was like, why am I so sympathetic towards Bogart's character? He's a bad guy, but yet I'm kind of secretly cheering for him. Perfect example of an anti-hero. I hope he gets redemption. That's all I want. One of the great things about this was watching Bette Davis. I mean, she was at the peak of her beauty, her power as an actress. She's just exquisite. It really established her as one of the most exciting leading ladies around. And you also forget how incredible Leslie Howard was. You know, I think we really know him from is Gone with the Wind, but watch this movie. And yes, there's some similar attributes to, Ashley Wilkes from Gone with the Wind in this movie, but he's such a good grounded actor that you just can't take your eyes off of him. And this film also introduced me to the exquisite pleasure of actress Genevieve Tobin. She steals almost every scene she's in. She plays Mrs. Chisholm. She's this wealthy, bored housewife who finds being taken hostage by Duke Mantee kind of exciting. It's the most thrilling thing that's ever happened to her because she's married to this very dull, banker type. So for her, this was all fun. And she's just a scene stealer and she's great. The rest of the supporting cast is terrific. Porter Hall as Bette Davis's father, Joe Sawyer, Dick Moran, and also the great character actor Paul Harvey. A really fun fact about this movie, and I think we might have mentioned this on a previous episode, but it started out as a play. And when it moved to Hollywood, the studio did not want Humphrey Bogart, who had done the play originally with Leslie Howard. Well, Leslie
Yes.
Howard, being the outstanding guy that he is, he stood up to the studio and said, I have cast approval and I will not do this movie without Humphrey Bogart. And that's what got Humphrey Bogart in. And this is the movie that made him a star. Humphrey Bogart never forgot that and had such love and respect for Leslie Howard. When he and Lauren Bacall later had their first daughter, Leslie, of course, named after Leslie Howard.
Leslie Howard. So he really is Ashley Wilkes in real life too.
He is, and I just love that. But that's my first film.
I love that choice. All right, my second film is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939. It's from that year that everybody talks about, directed by Frank Capra. Yep, magical year. Directed by Frank Capra, written by Sidney Buckman from a story by Louis R. Foster. This film was nominated for 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor for Jimmy Stewart and Claude Rains, and for Harry Carey as supporting actor. It's the story of an idealistic young man, Jefferson Smith, played by James Stewart. Although he has no political experience, when one of the senators from his state passes away, Governor Hopper, played by our friend Guy Kibbe, appoints Jefferson Smith as the replacement senator, and he joins senior Senator Joseph Payne, played by Claude Rains, in Washington. Claude Rains' character happens to be Jefferson Smith's childhood hero. Jimmy Stewart's character is the model of patriotism and naivete. When he gets to Washington, nearly everyone around him believes he can be manipulated to do their bidding with illegal affairs surrounding this dam in his home state. Jimmy Stewart wants the land to be used for a boys' camp, but corrupt businessman Jim Taylor, played by Edward Arnold, with help from the equally corrupt Senator Payne, Claude Rains, you bad, bad man. They have other ideas. So the question becomes ultimately, is Jefferson Smith, with the help of his assistant, Saunders, played by Jean Arthur. I love that the character just has the one name, Saunders. Are the two of them going to be able to take on the big boys in Washington and overcome, these evil forces? I found it interesting in doing my research on this film that one of the reasons Frank Capra made this film was to help him get over the loss of his infant son, who had died from complications from a tonsillectomy. And just looking at Capra and how he cast his films, he is quoted as saying, no matter if somebody's in the film for 30 seconds or the whole film, casting was extremely important. And you can see that in every one of his films, the care that he takes. He also said that screen tests to him were an imposition, that he would rather just talk to the actors. Clearly, he loved actors. Talk about our love of character actors. This one, every frame of it has somebody you'll point and pick out and say, oh my gosh, there's Charles Lane. As I mentioned, there's Guy Kibbe, Edward Arnold, Beulah Bondi.
Oh, Beulah.
Again, played Stewart's mother 5 times over the years. William Demarest, Uncle Charlie from My Three Sons, Dick Elliott, Thomas Mitchell, some pretty amazing children as well. And some interesting parallels to It's a Wonderful Life, in that many of these same actors, including one of the young boys that plays the governor's son, he's in It's a Wonderful Life as Pete Bailey. And it's a film that Auld Lang Syne is played to the backdrop of Stewart being celebrated just as it is in It's a Wonderful Life, just a few years later. And just to touch on Jean Arthur in this movie, she plays one of the best drunks ever. Her chemistry with Stewart is wonderful. There are some powerfully patriotic scenes, which apparently the scenes at the Lincoln Memorial and the Declaration of Independence and all the scenes in Washington, they were stolen, meaning they didn't have permits to shoot. They couldn't get the Park Service to give them permits, so they stole the shots. And finally, Jimmy Stewart's gee whiz kind of enthusiasm juxtaposed against the cynicism of Washington, D.C. It's still as true today as it was back then. You hope that good will win out. In this case, it does. It's a phenomenal film. And I think it's a really timely one to watch right now.
Absolutely. And my love for Jean Arthur is very, very, very deep. I think Jean Arthur is one of the best comedians we've ever seen ever in film history. And that leads up to my next film. It's a film that she starred in from 1937 called Easy Living. It was directed by Mitchell Lesson, written by Preston Sturges, the great, an incredible cast. And it's just this phenomenal screwball comedy about this comic misunderstanding that occurs when this wealthy banker named J.B. Ball, I love that name, played by Edward Arnold, again, Edward Arnold, the great.
Another one, yeah.
He ends up throwing his wife's very expensive fur coat off the roof of their penthouse apartment in Manhattan to teach her a lesson. And it lands on the head of this stenographer who's riding an open air bus down below. So, of course, the stenographer is played by Jean Arthur. And being Jean Arthur in a 1930s film, she tries to do the right thing. So she goes to return the coat. Well, this leads to everybody in Manhattan being convinced that she is J.B. Ball's mistress and that she has access to his power, his influence, everything. Everyone starts treating her like a queen. They give her accounts in stores and they help her get a luxury apartment that she can't afford. And it's just this comic misunderstanding that is just a snowball effect. It's hilarious. It's Jean Arthur at her absolute best. She's never better than when she's a doe-eyed innocent who's thrown into this potentially scandalous situation because of a misunderstanding.
Yes.
And playing her love interest is Ray Milland. He's wonderful. He's also happens to be J.B. Ball's son, but he has turned his back on the wealth and the privilege and he wants to make it on his own. So Jean Arthur has no idea that he's the son, and some more confusion and comedy ensues. And it's just a wonderful, clever movie. And if you haven't seen it, you really should. And the ending I especially love because it's the perfect ending, because at the end, J.B. Ball, everything's sort of been settled and Ray Milland is with Jean and everything's good. So J.B. Ball gets mad at his wife again at the very end of the movie, throws another fur coat over the balcony, and there's a young woman walking down the street and it drops on her head. And scene.
And scene.
And the woman is the woman who it drops on in just that one little tiny bit is Marsha Hunt.
Oh my gosh. How cool is that?
I know. It's such a good movie.
All right. I'm going to check it out. It's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
Well, in keeping with the theme of the 1930s films, the question is, for many, many years, the AFI did a 100 films, 100 years. And the last one they did was their 10th anniversary edition. Can you name any of the top 5 films from the 1930s that made the list?
Ooh, good question.
Yeah.
All right. We will be back with the answer and more of our top 1930s films after this.
All right, Steve and Ann will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. In 1913, Cecil B. DeMille rented a barn on Vine Street in Hollywood for $75 a month. He used it to shoot Hollywood's first full-length feature film. It was called The Squaw Man. Now, it was a pioneering move for the time. See, most films were short reels, often not much longer than a few minutes. Well, this barn didn't just witness the beginning of Hollywood's film journey. It was crucial in the early development of the film industry. And today you can actually visit this historic barn. It's been transformed into the Hollywood Heritage Museum on Highland Avenue. It's right across from the Hollywood Bowl. And now back to Steve and Ann from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm going to dive in, Steve, with my next choice, which is Stage Door from 1937. It's directed by Gregory LaCava, written by Maury Riskind and Anthony Weiler, from the play by Edna Ferber and Georges Kaufman. This was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actress in a supporting role for Andrea Leeds. We talked about the Hollywood Studio Club in a previous episode, and this film takes place at the Footlights Club, which is a fictitious, I think, kind of a rendition of that. It follows a group of struggling actresses living together in a boarding house as they try to fulfill their dreams and their ambitions, and they definitely juggle their share of disappointments and ultimately the tragedy of one of them. The group of actresses is led by Ginger Rogers, who plays Jean Maitland, and the posh newbie to the boarding house, Terry Randall, played by none other than Katharine Hepburn. Now, she arrives and the two are forced to become roommates. Most of the women in the house don't care for Terry, Katharine Hepburn's character, because she clearly has money and really no training and a lot of confidence. The other women in this boarding house are a pretty sensational group. I'd want to hang out with them. There's Lucille Ball, there's Eve Arden, there's Ann Miller, who I believe was only 13 or 14 years old when she made this film. She lied about her age. And the fabulous Gail Patrick, who always plays a good.
Oh, I love her.
Evil beauty. Yeah, she's wonderful. Constance Collier plays Miss Luther, the house mother. Our friend Franklin Pangborn makes an appearance as the butler to Adolphe Menjou's producer, Anthony Powell. And as I mentioned, Andrea Leeds plays Kay Hamilton, who Ginger Rogers in the film calls the best actress in the house, but who ultimately succumbs to the pressures and disappointments of being an actor, and it's a tragic ending. This is on the heels of Terry Randall, Katharine Hepburn, getting the part in a new play that Kay was convinced and desperately wanted and probably should have gotten. But Katharine Hepburn's father in the film secretly financed the play, knowing that if she got on stage, she would be a flop and she would stop all her dreams of being an actress. But ultimately what ends up happening is when Kay Hamilton dies, it changes everything for Terry, and she triumphantly plays the part on Broadway and becomes a huge star. The calla lilies are in bloom again, such a lovely flower, is the classic Hepburn line. And the transformation that she makes in this film when she actually becomes the deep, specific, wonderful actress is actually taken from the play that Katharine Hepburn did called The Lake, which she infamously played in, and she apparently was not very good. And it's what sparked Dorothy Parker's famous line, she ran the gamut of emotions from A to B.
I love that line.
It's a terrific script. The overlapping dialogue for this time period is played with just such finesse and such a wonderful zest. It's just a fabulous film. And the film ends with another young, naive actress entering the hallowed halls of the Footlights Club. And you sense this dream and ambition is cyclical, and it's just going to start all over again, because there's always going to be an actor that's out there that has dreams and hopes to fulfill them.
The story continues.
The story continues.
Yeah,
All right,
great choice. My next film is one of my personal favorites. It's absolutely my favorite screwball comedy of all time. It is The Awful Truth from 1937, directed by Leo McCarey, based on the 1922 play by Arthur Richmond. The screenplay was by Dina Delmer. Fantastic cast. It's a simple premise. There's this amazing, sophisticated couple in Manhattan who, because of some comic misunderstandings, decide that they're going to get divorced, but they're still very much in love with each other. So the divorce goes on as planned, except they fight over the dog, Smitty. And of course, Smitty is played by Skippy, who we've also mentioned in a previous episode about animals. He was also Asta from the Thin Mans, who plays Skippy. Well, our sophisticated couple are played by none other than Cary Grant and Irene Dunne. And man, talk about comic chemistry. I mean, if you want to see probably the best example of comic chemistry on film, watch this movie. It is amazing. The film ended up winning a Best Director Oscar for Leo McCarey. It was nominated for Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actor for Ralph Bellamy, who's wonderful in this, Best Writing for Vina Del Mar, and Best Editing for Al Clark. But inexplicably, Cary Grant was not nominated. And it's still shocking to me that Irene Dunne and Cary Grant never won an Oscar, period. So that's a whole other story.
They both just made it look too easy.
Too easy, yeah. One thing that I love about this movie is it really taught me about comic timing, scenic rhythm, and the great benefit of old-fashioned chemistry, which you cannot manufacture. And Irene and Cary had it in spades. This was the first of 3 films they did together. They went on to make another screwball comedy called My Favorite Wife in 1940, which was aided greatly by, again, Gail Patrick and Randolph Scott. And they ended their screen partnership. Their third film together was this very lovely film called Penny Serenade from 1941, which is a heartbreaker. And for this picture, Cary Grant was Oscar nominated, but Irene Dunne was not. So go figure. And it's a shame that they didn't make more movies together, because they just had that great dynamic together. But it seems to me, looking at the way things unfolded in history, as Cary got older, he started getting paired with younger and younger leading ladies. You know, Sophia Loren and Leslie Caron and Audrey Hepburn. Whereas when Irene got older, she was regulated to move into matronly roles like Mama in I Remember Mama, or Queen Victoria in The Murdoch. Not fair. I personally
was ever thus, right? Oh my gosh.
For me, I wish they had paired Irene Dunne with somebody like Robert Wagner or Tony Curtis and let her be the sexy older woman to this young stud. To me, that's interesting. But what Hollywood has a tendency to do, and it was so frustrating and so wrong. They tended to desexualize actresses as they got older, whereas Cary Grant could just go on and charm his way into, every young leading lady's pants in town. Not fair.
Right. Well, I think that still is prevalent today. It's a little better in that women in their 50s are sometimes considered sexual creatures, but it still is a problem. So shame on Hollywood.
And I just want to conclude with, there's one scene in this movie. If you can't watch the whole movie, go watch the YouTube clip of this movie, because it is a doozy and you will laugh out loud. It's when Cary Grant has met this new woman. She's this very hoity-toity society woman, and he's meeting all of her wealthy, influential family members. Well, Irene Dunne shows up and passes herself off as his sister, and she comes in as this loud, gaudy, tacky, embarrassing woman. And it is one of the funniest, most brilliant comic scenes you'll ever see in a film.
I love it. I love it. Great choice, Steve. Great choice. All right. I'm going to jump in with my last one here, which is My Man Godfrey. Speaking of chemistry in a screwball comedy, My Man Godfrey from 1936. This is directed again by Gregory LaCava, written by Maury Riskind and Eric Hatch, based on his novel 1101 Park Avenue. Let me give you the plot really quickly. A scatterbrained, spoiled heiress, Irene Bullock, played by Carol Lombard, hires a supposed drifter as a family butler. He's played by William Powell, but there's much more to Godfrey than meets the eye. Now, this is set during the depths of the Depression, and Carol Lombard, as Irene Bullock, is on a scavenger hunt to a city dump when she meets Godfrey, who she ultimately hires as the family butler in this definition of dysfunctional family. She manages to beat out her sister, played by Gail Patrick. I'm seeing a theme here, who, as we've said, is always so good at playing that nasty rich woman. Godfrey does indeed come to work for them, but what no one knows is that Godfrey is not a drifter. He's a wealthy man who is hiding to recover from a bad love affair. Of course, Carol Lombard falls in love with William Powell, but ultimately he's not sure if he's ready for another love affair. Now, this film was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Director and Writing. Carol Lombard's only nomination for Best Actress, and William Powell was also nominated. And Alice Brady got a supporting actress nod as Mother Angelica Bullock. And now Eugene Pallett, I just have to mention him. He is the gravel-voiced character actor who plays his father. He could play anything. He could play the heavy. He could play this comic film. In real life, of course, William Powell was married to Carol Lombard from 1931 to 1933. When Powell was offered the title role, he apparently declared that Lombard was the only actress for the role of Irene. And he was reportedly devastated when she died in a plane crash in 1942. Their chemistry in this film is just absolutely brilliant. I was reading up on it, and Roger Ebert wrote a wonderful piece about this film and goes into great detail about the performances in the black and white photography. But he pulled out a couple of lines. One of them that she says is, "I'd like to sew his buttons on sometime when they come off," which in 1936, because they had buttons on their underwear, we don't have that now. You can imagine what that was meant to imply. And when she asks Godfrey to be the butler, she says, "Do you buttle?" which has this whole other meaning as well. It's just one of our best screwball comedies, and they are so effortless in their relationship together. This one is also free on Tubi. It's also free on Amazon Prime. It's colorized on Amazon Prime. So I would say see the black and white, because the black and white photography is truly gorgeous. That's My Man Godfrey.
Oh, such a great choice. I love that film. I haven't seen it in years. I definitely want to revisit it.
Yeah, it's a great one.
Well, my final film, what's a list from the 1930s without Barbara Stanwyck?
Well,
come on.
This is why I was hating myself for not having her on my list.
I know, and honestly, Stella Dallas was on my list too, but we had just talked about it. So I said, nope.
Right.
But I am going to talk about Golden Boy from 1939. It's based on the Clifford Odets 1937 play. The screenplay was by Louis Meltzer, Daniel Teradash, Sarah Y. Mason, Victor Heerman. Incredible cast, incredible story. I think many of us who listen to this podcast probably remember the night in 1982 when the Academy Award finally bestowed an honorary Oscar to the great Barbara Stanwyck.
Yeah.
Long overdue, and criminal that she never never won a competitive one. Well, as she stood on stage, she reminded the audiences that just a few years earlier, she had been on that very stage as a presenter with William Holden, who had just passed away. Her voice cracked a bit as she continued, and she said, "I loved him very much, and I miss him. He always wished that I could get an Oscar, and so tonight, my golden boy, you got your wish."
Oh,
Yeah, there was not a dry eye in the house when she did that. And
I'm crying right now.
and it all started making the film Golden Boy. Columbia bought the rights from Clifford Odets as a vehicle for Jean Arthur initially, and they wanted Frank Capra to direct it, but that never materialized. Instead, it went to director Ruben Mamoulian, and he got a hold of it, and he cast Barbara Stanwyck and a very young and inexperienced William Holden as the lead. Well, the story is basically about this sensitive violinist who, because he needs to make money for his family, he decides to become a boxer to earn money. Again, it's genteel lifestyle versus the brutal, brutish lifestyle. And this is what he comes to symbolize. And that's basically the story. It's this inner conflict he has. And Barbara Stanwyck, of course, becomes the love interest as we go along. And it's just this beautiful story. But when they made the movie in 1939, Stanwyck was already a huge star, whereas William Holden was just coming up the ranks. So this was his first big break. Well, the producers were so unhappy with William Holden's performance that they wanted to fire him. Well, when Mama Bear Barbara Stanwyck got wind of that, she swooped in and told them, "You fire that boy and I will walk." And this... and so they worked with Holden. She worked with him privately. She helped him. She really coached him. And he ended up making such a mark in the film business in this movie. It made him a star. It launched his career, and he never, ever forgot it. And he always, to the day he died, said, "I owe my entire career to Barbara Stanwyck." And
I love that story.
I love that story. I love this movie. It's so great. You really see their great chemistry together. It's got a great supporting cast, again, with Adolphe Menjou, Lee J. Cobb, Sam Levine, Edward Brophy. Great cast. But surprisingly, it only received one single Oscar nomination for Victor Young's musical score. Go figure.
Go figure. There's no figuring out that Academy, let me tell you.
Nope.
Again, just might as well not even try. Well, Steve, this has been so fun, and there are others that we just didn't even have time to cover. So we might have to revisit this some other point down the road.
I know, but I'm looking forward to next month when we talk about our favorite films from the 1940s.
Okay, that's going to be even harder, though, to come up with just four.
Yeah, that's my favorite decade for sure, the 40s. Yeah,
I think it has to be one of the top decades. Well, let's get the answer to this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
All right, and the question was, in AFI's final top 100 movies of all time, of the 1930s movies that made the list, which 5 ranked highest? Can you name any of the 5?
I'm going to say Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
You'd be correct.
All right. I'm going to say Wizard of Oz.
You would be correct.
I'm going to say Gone with the Wind.
You would be correct. You're 3 for 3.
I'm 3 for 3. Okay.
I don't think you're going to get the last 2 because I didn't.
All right. Then I'm just not even going to tell me.
All right. Gone with the Wind came in at number 6. The Wizard of Oz came in at number 10.
Okay.
At number 11 was City Lights, Charlie Chaplin.
Of course, Charlie Chaplin.
Of course. At number 26 was Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And at number 34 was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
All right. Well, this has been great. Thanks for listening, everybody. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star review and subscribe on wherever you listen to podcasts. You can follow us on social media. Our handle is @FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign, and we are on Instagram, Facebook, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And please keep those emails coming. We love them. Any suggestions, comments, anything. We love it. You can reach us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review. And tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production production supervisor, Lindsay Schnebley. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2024, all rights reserved. That's a wrap.